In the affirmative team, we have Divine Word University. Our first speaker, Daniel Kabata. The second speaker, Taisha Philemon. The third speaker, Arnel Sopol. And the fourth speaker, Margaret Simet. In the negative or the opposition team, we have the University of Technology, the first speaker, Angela D. Wali. The second speaker, Tania Jinga. The third speaker, Emmanuel Y. And the fourth speaker, Brent Carroll. Debaters, you may take your seats. The topic for this debate is Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is entirely consistent within the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to call upon the first speaker from the affirmative team to deliver his speech.
Thank you, Chairperson, and good morning to you. Good morning, educators, timekeepers, my fellow debaters, and of course, the wonderful audience. I am the first speaker of the affirmative team going for the motion. Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important that you pay attention and listen attentively. As the first speaker, I will be talking about the alignment of Vision 2050 to global framework. The second speaker will elaborate on how this aligning facilitates acquiring resources and funding. Our third speaker will talk about how Vision 20 is entirely consistent. And finally, our final speaker will summarize and reaffirm our stance. Moving on. Derived from Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050, Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is the national government's strategic directional statement that will guide nations' development agenda with regards to United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The overall goal of the United Nations Sustainable Development is a long-term stability of the economy and environment. This is only achievable through the integration and acknowledgement of economic, environmental, and social concerns throughout decision-making process. According to United Nations Organization, the United Nations is an interaction norm and standard of behavior for all its member states to follow, and that includes Papua New Guinea. PNG has a client-based relationship. within the UN. Now, a client-based relationship. A client-based relationship refers to the interaction between one or more actors in the international system in which one party, the client, is dependent on another party. This other party, which is the patron, and the party that is dependent on, the party that is dependent on is the client. In this case, the UN is the patron, and Papua New Guinea is the client. The United Nations being the patron, Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 was derived from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So to say that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are not entirely consistent with Vision 2050 is directly saying that Papua New Guinea is not aligned with the United Nations, which is not true. Apart from being a development partner, the UN is looked as a model of development in most least developed and the developing countries. Hence, the Vision 2050. The Vision 2050 is designed in a way to satisfy our unique needs according to the UN's framework and sustainable development. Even the aim of Vision 2050 is to be ranked in the top 50 countries of the United Nations Human Development Index by 2050. So to say that Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals does not make sense. Because the sole aim of this Vision 2050 is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations by attempting to become a smart, wise, friendly, and happy society by 2050. The consistency of Vision 2050. The consistency of Vision 2050 with United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goal is the alignment of specific targets and objectives. The 7 pillars. The 7 pillars are in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Pillar 1 is in line with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 1, 4, and 5. Therefore, we can see that PNG's 2050, Vision 2050 is consistent due to the alignment with UN SDG. This Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the UN SDGs. In other words, where did we get the idea to create? This is where we got the idea to create a roadmap. According to UN Conference on Trade and Development, most developing countries whom are members of the UN have a Vision 2050 because the United Nations Sustainable Goals are aimed at helping developing countries to reach the developed stage. Therefore, with that being said, PNG's Vision 2050 is aligned to global framework, which also known as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Hence, we the affirmative strongly believe that yes, Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to call upon the first speaker from the opposition to respond.
vision for the future is only as good as the people who believe in it and work together to achieve a better Papua New Guinea. Thank you, Chair Lady. Good morning, adjudicators, timekeeper, my fellow debaters, and this wonderful audience. My name is Angela Dainwali, and I'm the first speaker of the negative team going against the topic that Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In this round, my team and I will be clarifying our stance on the topic in debate through the critical analysis of both PNG Vision 2050 key pillars and the SDGs. But before I move on to my argument, allow me to make a few rebuttals on the vague and deceptive points made by the affirmative. Summarizing the first points made by the affirmative, I basically state that their points were made on the grounds of global partnership. Now, diversification without clear prioritization can scatter resources and may not necessarily align with SDGs, which emphasize targeted and sustainable approaches. I back this up with a quote from OECD on OECD's research on economic diversification, open quote, "Economic diversification for its own sake can lead to inefficiencies and misallocation of resources," close quote. Moving on to my points. We begin by the defining of key terms. Sustainable Development Goals, defined by Net Geo Education 2019, are a collection of 17 global goals aimed at improving the planet and quality of human life. Oxford Learner's Dictionary defines consistent as always behaving in the same way or having the same opinions, standards, etc. And lastly, PNG Vision 2050 is a national development blueprint consisting of 7 pillars that aspire for Papua New Guinea to build a smart, wise, fair, healthy, and happy society. Kaiku 2020. Let us take a look at Pillar 3 of Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050. Pillar 3, Institutional Development and Service Delivery. Now, the question posed is, does the 2050 vision align with the SDGs? While Vision 2050 has its specific objectives and priorities, there are areas where further alignment of SDGs are needed. According to Pacific Energy Portal 2020, open quote, the SDGs cover a broad range of sustainable economic and environment aspects. Vision 2050's pillars may not explicitly address all of these dimensions, close quote. Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 was developed before the adoption of the United Nations SDGs. Vision 2050 came about in 2009, and the UN's SDGs was introduced in 2015. As a result, Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is unique to the country's specific context and priorities. It takes into account the social, economic, and environmental challenges faced by Papua New Guinea and outlines its own long-term development objectives and strategies. When we place these key pillars next to the SDGs developed by the UN, we see that Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent with the SDGs. Instead, it is tailored to suit the people's needs, but also simultaneously captures the relevant elements, or should I say goals, of the SDGs. The SDGs sets a 100% achievement of its goals by 2030, which is only 7 years from now. And judging by the pace at which we're going, this would be very unrealistic. Meanwhile, Vision 2050 aims to cover a good if not better percentage of institutional development and service delivery today, tomorrow, and beyond. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, there is inconsistency between the two. One is for short term and the other designed for the long term. Before I take my seat, I conclude with a quote from the late Grand Chief Sir Michael Tomare, one of our forefathers, a visionary and the man behind PNG Vision 2050. Open quote, "I want to assure our people that the Papua New Guinea Vision 2050 is a homegrown initiative," close quote. In other words, we, the negative team, without utter doubt, and stand firmly by saying that Papua New Guinea's Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent, but is instead unique to the country's specific context and priorities with respect to the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call upon the second speaker from the affirmative team to take the floor.
Thank you, moderator. Good morning, judges, timekeeper, fellow debaters, and the lovely audience present today. I am the second speaker of the affirmative team, affirming the motion, PNG's Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the UN Sustainable Goal. Before I move into my points, I'd like to make a rebuttal made by the negative team. They mentioned a contrast between the years in which the Vision 2050 was established as well as when the SDG was established. Yes, we, the affirmative, are aware that the Vision 2050 was launched in 2009 and the SDGs were introduced in 2015. However, SDG was a successor of the Millennium Development Goals introduced in 2000, set to expire in 2015, the year SDG was launched. My first speaker has stressed on the alignment of national goals to global frameworks. I will build on this discussion by explaining the international alignment and how it facilitates the acquiring of resources and funds. An international to national alignment allows for resource acquisition. According to the 2022 United Nations Arrival Results Report on Papua New Guinea, there are currently 19 UN agencies spread across 22 provinces in the country with 133 projects costing $94 million implemented. How do you explain this inflow of resources funding in our national development? There must be a connection that allows this between the international and national levels. This connection lies between the United States Sustainable Development Goals and the PNG Vision 2050. This statement is supported by Papua New Guinea's Voluntary Review 2020. Furthermore, we cannot deny, and it is a common phenomenon in Papua New Guinea, where in the places the national, provincial, and local governments connect rich, international agencies are present there. The reason we see organizations like the United Nations in rural communities is because we need their assistance to achieve our development goals, which inheriting coincides with theirs as well. According to 2012 Asian Development Bank's country diagnostics, Papua New Guinea, the national government cannot meet the needs of rural communities as it does not have the capacity to. The United Nations website highlighted that there are 62 United Nation activities in the southern region, 127 in the New Guinea Islands region, and a total of 130 in the Highlands region. These activities are only in place because of the consistency between the United States Sustainable Goals and Vision 2050. Both development plans help each other and achieve their goals respectively. So, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the negative team, let us learn from this argument where we, the affirmative, would like to remind us all that this alignment strengthens partnership between United Nations and its members, PNG and United Nations. Henceforth, PNG's Vision 2050 alignment with the UN Sustainable Goals, this alignment and relationship fosters knowledge sharing, acquiring of resources and funds. Therefore, we the affirmative strongly believe that the PNG Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the UN Sustainable Goal. Thank you.
Thank you. And now call upon the second speaker from the negative team to respond.
Wealth creation, natural resources and growth nodes, environmental sustainability and climate change. These are two key pillars in the Papua New Guinea Vision 2050, and they will be the basis of my argument this morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tanya Jinga, and I'm the second speaker of the opposing team, who are going against the notion that Papua New Guinea Vision 2015 is entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Before I go into my point, I would like to rebut what has been said by the affirmative team. Firstly, let me clarify our stance. We are not saying that the Sustainable Development Goals and Vision 2050 are not related. We are not saying that we do not benefit from the United Nations, because we do, and that is undeniable. However, what we are saying is it is not entirely consistent, because it is not. Thank you. Moving on to my point. As a developing country, Papua New Guinea's approach places a greater emphasis on economic development and resource extraction. This is in relation to one of the key pillars that I have mentioned earlier: wealth creation, natural resources, and growth nodes. However, the United Nations places a greater emphasis on environmental sustainability. This is backed up by the Sustainable Development Goals number 15, which says life on land, and number 13, climate action. Do you see how these two misalign? One is asking for resource extraction, and one is asking for land sustainability. According to data from the Food and Agriculture Organization taken from the United Nations website, Papua New Guinea's forest cover has declined from an estimated 46 million hectares in 1990 to 36 million hectares in 2020. This represents a decline of almost 20%. This is largely due to the increase in commercial agriculture and mining industries, which is good for our economy on one hand, but is bad for our environment on the other hand. The loss of forest cover and other natural habitats due to land use can have significant impacts on environmental sustainability, including the loss of biodiversity, the disruption of ecosystems, and the increase in carbon emissions. This directly opposes the Sustainable Development Goal number 15, which aims to, and I quote, protect and restore terrestrial ecosystems and halt biodiversity loss, ensuring the conservation of natural habitats and ecosystems, end quote. Therefore, I would like to conclude by saying that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a generic framework created with the intention of being universal in nature. However, the Papua New Guinea Vision 2050 is the homegrown brainchild of Papua New Guinea, and as such, it takes into account our unique struggles and way of life. To say that one is entirely consistent with the other completely disregards Papua New Guinea's distinctive challenges. That is why we, the opposition, strongly, firmly, completely believe that Papua New Guinea Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call upon the third speaker from the affirmative team to the floor.
Thank you, moderator. Good morning, judges, timekeeper, fellow debaters. Thank you, moderator. Good morning, judges, timekeeper, fellow debaters, and the lovely audience. Before I move on to my argument, I would like to make a rebuttal to what the negative team has stated. They have stated that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals focuses more on the environmental aspect. However, the Vision 2050, the fifth pillar of the Vision 2050, also focuses on environmental sustainability. So they are not totally disregarding wealth creation. Ladies and gentlemen, for a motion such as this, we have to be wise by taking a holistic approach so that we are not easily confused by the negative. So holistically, both the Vision 2050 and the United Nations SDGs are trying to tackle environmental, social, and economic issues. Therefore, they are both consistent by definition and purpose. When we try to look at how the Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the United Nations SDGs, it is important to consider three themes. These are environmental, social, and economic. According to UNDP 2021, the sustainable goals of the United Nations are integrated into each member state's long-term development plan. And it further states that any development plan must balance social, economic, and environmental sustainability. If you take a look at PNG's Vision 2050, all these themes are expanded and put into 7 strategic areas or pillars to focus on and achieve by 2050. So where is the inconsistency? For example, goals 13, 14, and 15 of the United Nations SDGs addresses environmental issues and also correlates with the 5th pillar of the Vision 2050, which is environmental sustainability and climate change. Isn't that consistency? Does it matter whether the goals are consistent realistically or not? No, it doesn't. Ladies and gentlemen, do not be swayed from the truth. The motion is not asking us to measure these 2 sets of goals on whether they were achieved or not. The motion is simply just simply asking if these goals are entirely consistent with each other. And evidently, they are consistent because they aim to address the same problems. If we're discussing in terms of physical implementations, there are 19 UN agencies present in all 22 provinces of Papua New Guinea, as stated by our second speaker. And this information is derived from the 2022 UN annual results of Papua New Guinea. Even though most of these projects may have flaws in the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, it is better to have something rather than nothing, right? It is wise to have a plan with a destination rather than no plan, right? It is important that PNG's Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in order to satisfy our unique needs in PNG. Because as our second speaker has stated, where the hand of the government does not reach, the international development partner does. Therefore, we, the affirmative, strongly believe without a doubt that the PNG Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now call upon the third speaker from the opposition team to respond.
Great nations are built on the framework of visionary plans. PNG is poised to be a nation to be envied upon. For this purpose, the government has envisioned the creation of a new society by 2050, which is expected to be smart, wise, fair, healthy, and happy. Musawe Sinabale. Thank you, Chair Lady. Good morning, the judges, the timekeeper, my fellow debaters, the viewers online, and the lovely audience of the floor. As mentioned by my first speaker, my name is Emmanuel Y, and I am the third speaker of the negative side, going against the motion that PNG's Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by saying that PNG's Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent with the UN SDGs. As the third speaker, I will be presenting to you one of the 7 pillars of Vision 2050 and comparing it with UN's Sustainable Development with the intention to prove that PNG's Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent with UN Sustainable Development Goals. But before I go into my point, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to rebut on just 2 of the points made by the government side. The government side presented in their first point a shallow point in their own words, and I quote, all the pillars are aligned to UN SDG, and they proceeded on to quote pillars 1, 4, and 5. Now someone hit me with a brick if I'm wrong, but if my memory serves me right, the PNG Vision 2050 has 7 key pillars, not 3. Supporting your point with only 3 is only a contradiction to your own word. Secondly, presenting only 3 of the 7 points just proves all the more my point by showing that PNG's Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, in their third point, the government presented saying that bringing up environmental sustainability from SDG and saying that the 5th pillar also supports environmental sustainability. Again, bringing again one of the 3 pillars that goes aligned and leaving out the 4, contradicting themselves again. Now, on to my point. Before we embark on my point, I would like to establish an understanding so that we can all be on the same page. Now, understand this. PNG is a developing nation, and the UN is not a nation. Rather, it is an international organization consisting of a total of 193 member nations, both developed and developing countries, according to the UN website. Now, with that being understood, ladies and gentlemen, I will be presenting to you about the 6th pillar of the PNG 2050 vision, which is spiritual, cultural, and community development. Now, according to PNG Vision 2050, National Strategic Plan Task Force document published on the official website of the Department of Treasury, it is explained that the spiritual development and highlighted that spiritual development is basically about increasing the role of the church in our country. Now, after spending a good amount of time carefully reading through the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I noticed that they did not have a goal for spiritual development or religion. Now, this is because United Nations is an organization that has members who have different religion beliefs, and so it tends to be neutral when it comes to religion. According to a website called International Relations, the United Nations, as a secular organization, has no common religion. PNG, as a declared Christian nation, that is why we have spiritual development or religion as one of the 7 key pillars of the PNG Vision 2050. Now, my fellow audience, if we possess an attribute which is considered to be scarce nowadays, which is, of course, common sense, we can clearly see that this shows that PNG's Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Therefore, in conclusion, we, the negative side, strongly and firmly believe and say, without the slightest doubt or hesitation, maintaining our stance going against the topic by restating the topic and saying that PNG's Vision 2050 is not, and I repeat, it is not entirely consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now call upon the 4th and final speaker from the affirmative team to the floor.
The UN wasn't created to take mankind into paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell. Doug Hammarskjöld. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is important that I summarize the points of the proposition side. However, I must invalidate some questionable statements raised by the opposition. Firstly, the opposition has mentioned that Vision 2050 is a homegrown. The Vision 2050 is homegrown. This is what the opposition has mentioned. However, it is not. There is a difference between Vision 2050 and the Constitution, which is homegrown. Vision 2050 is a global influence. Our Constitution is homegrown. The Department of Public Affairs stated in the analysis of national development plans in PNG 2020 article that the Vision 2050 was not homegrown and is in fact driven by PNG's increasing conformity to global policy trends. In fact, the Vision 2050 contradicts the fifth national directive principle, which is Papua New Guinean ways, because it is not homegrown. It is a global influence. Secondly, the opposition has brought up the discussion of these two, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the PNG Vision 2050, as being unrealistic and regarding the discussion of service delivery. We are not questioning the effectiveness of these two, so I would like to bring us back to the motion of whether they are consistent with each other. Moving forward, to reiterate and clarify, The PNG Vision 2050 stems from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Before something is institutionalized in a nation, it must be aligned globally. We need a global framework. Since we are existing members of the United Nations, it is only right that we must be aligned with their agenda, as the first speaker has already stressed. It's bigger than just listing pillars and comparing them against each other. It is not about what one pillar says compared to the other. It is about the context of what the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals has in comparison to the PNG Vision 2050, which is not the same. To better understand, our second speaker, I will expand in terms of an analogy. In a group of 4, I will use my speakers as examples. In a group of 4, I am the leader. I instruct each of these individuals to build a house. In each house must have a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room. However they build that house is completely up to them. All I want is a house with a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room. What this means is the United Nations has these goals implemented already. The member countries will then adopt the framework of the Vision 2050 and of course tailor it to their own country's needs and how they decide to carry out their administration. That is the way administration works. There is no other way around it. Context is very, very important. You cannot just line up 17 pillars on one side, 17 goals on one side, and 7 pillars on the other side, and compare them against each other based off of their words alone, because at first glance, of course, they are not the same. Supporting evidence for why I have brought up the analogy. The United Nations PNG website highlighted 62 UN activities in the southern region, 91 in the islands region, 127 in the Momase region, and 130 in the highlands region. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is an international organization. They know what they are doing. Why would they invest so much in a country that is, and I quote, not entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? It only goes to show they are extorting resources into a country that they know for sure is working towards the targeted aims that they have already set for them. This brings us back to the analogy that I have already brought up. I am giving each of my 3 members resources and funds because I know they are working towards the aim that I have set for them. This is why there are so many UN activities, United Nations activities within the country. Because of that reason, because we are working towards goals that have already been set for us. And further proving that we are consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Like I said, context is very important. The opposition is trying to confuse us with all the other statements. However, it is not difficult to understand. It is not rocket science. Looking closely at both of them, both the PNG Vision 2050 and the United Nations Sustainability Goals, there are 3 main themes, as my third speaker has already mentioned. Economics, the economic aspect, the social aspect, and the environment aspect. One goal. All of these pillars and goals are working towards achieving a global goal. How is that not entirely consistent? And so, no man is an island. In order to be a safe, sustainable, and innovative PNG in the year 2050, that is a statement we need to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call upon the fourth and final speaker from the opposition team to respond.
According to Dev Policy Blog, not a single sustainable development goal will be met by 2030 if current trends continue. And you ask why the United Nations are investing into Papua New Guinea. They are working towards their goal. What about us? What are we working towards? That is why we, Papua New Guinea, have our own vision and our goal. Thank you, Chair Lady. Good morning, adjudicators, timekeepers, fellow debaters, and of course, ladies and gentlemen, online and on land. I'll be the fourth and final speaker of the opposing team, going strongly against the motion. The Papua New Guinea Vision 2050 is entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I would speak on the seventh key pillar, relating it why it is important in the context of sustainable development goals, and then summarize, conclude, and give recommendations. But before I do that, allow me to shed some light on this mysterious storm brought to you by the opposition team. Now, misconceptions were made, and let me clarify and rebut on them. First and foremost, we have to understand what the motion is about. The motion clearly states Papua New Guinea Vision 2050 is entirely consistent, and for the last time, entirely consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development. So what is entirely consistent? Well, entirely, as defined by the Oxford Dictionary, is whole, simply. And consistent, as defined also by the Oxford Dictionary, is always behaving in the same way or have the same opinions. So simply put, PNG Vision 2050, entirely consistent meaning is the same as the Sustainable Development Goals. That the whole point of my team's argument is to prove that these are two different things. We are not saying they are not working. Yes, they are working. But one is working for the United Nations and one is working for Papua New Guinea. Please, we are not leading you astray and telling you that this and this and this and this, these are all happening. But we are telling you that one is different from the other. One has to be accomplished by 2030, whilst the other has to be accomplished by 2050. With that out of the way, let us move on to the seventh key pillar. Now, the seventh key pillars is strategic planning, integration, and control. Strategic planning, integration, and control. You try and find something along that line in the 17 SDGs. You will never find something close to it. That's the entire argument we are bringing across. That this is a separate and totally different goal here. They are not entirely the same. They are not entirely consistent. As mentioned by our first speaker in summary, Vision 2050 cannot meet all the sustainable development goals. There is a gap, and that gap is called inconsistency. According to the United Nations organization, the Sustainable Development Goals on the 1st of January 2016, the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development adopted by world leaders in September 2015 at an historic UN summit officially came into force. Also, according to ANSSR, economic priorities and progress assessment measures, it is stated that in 2009, the government of Papua New Guinea launched its Vision 2050. PNG Vision 2050 looks at Papua New Guinea alone. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals were created for both developed and developing nations, first world and third world nations. So some of the Sustainable Development Goals are practically impossible to be accomplished before 2030. Let me give you an example. SDG number 7, affordable and clean energy. According to Energy Sector Asian Development Bank, PNG has one of the lowest electrification rates in the Pacific, with only 13% of population having access to inconsistent electricity. And this 13% of population having access to electricity is mostly from urban areas. Now, let me ask you this question. Do you think that the rest of 87% population of Papua New Guinea will be able to access affordable, clean energy by 2030? Within 6 years, do you think PNG Power can pull all the power lines across the entirety of Papua New Guinea? Is it possible? Exactly. Thus, in conclusion, and also a supplement to the rebuttal, as mentioned by the affirmative team, that Vision 2050 is not an homegrown vision. In the words of the Sana, the late Grand Chief Sir Michael Sumare, on page X of PNG Vision 2050, paragraph 4, line 1, I want to assure our people that Papua New Guinea Vision 2050 is a homegrown institute. So we are not saying it, it's the founding father saying it. So if you rebut us, you're rebutting the founding father. And that is why we, the opposing team, therefore, strongly goes against the motion saying that PNG Vision 2050 is not entirely consistent with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you. We thank all of the debaters for debate 1 for the first round of our semifinals. They have shown complexity in their research, ability to engage in public speaking. There was evidence of analytical and critical thinking, listening skills, and use of persuasive language as they debated. Well done, both DWU and UOT teams. Please give them a round of applause. I now declare that debate 1 for round 1 closed. Teams may now leave the stage.